In the middle of the 13th century, the Mongols did not simply conquer lands. They erased expectations. From the walls of Baghdad to the mountains of Persia, every kingdom that had relied on tradition, faith, or distance had discovered the same terrible truth. The Mongols arrived faster than fear could travel. Cities surrendered and survived. Cities resisted and vanished. And in 1258, the heart of the Islamic world learned this lesson in fire. Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 5 centuries, fell in days. Libraries burned. Canals filled with corpses. The caliph himself was executed. The shock was not merely political. It was psychological. If Baghdad could fall, then nowhere was protected by history, holiness, or reputation. News raced westward ahead of the armies. In Syria, rulers argued whether to flee, submit, or pray. Most chose submission. Aleppo resisted and was crushed. Damascus opened its gates and survived under Mongol rule. For the first time in living memory, the Eastern Islamic world had no frontier left. The Mongol frontier had become the Mediterranean, and south of Syria stood Egypt. Egypt was different, not because it was stronger on paper. Its armies were smaller than the forces that had already been destroyed, but because its rulers were not born into royalty. They were soldiers. The Mamluks were former slave warriors who had seized power through discipline and survival. Their state in Cairo was young, unstable, and surrounded by rivals. They could not afford fear, but they also could not afford illusion. When refugees from Syria arrived describing Mongol warfare, the Mamluk leadership did something rare. They listened. The stories were consistent. The Mongols did not rely on overwhelming numbers alone. They relied on coordination, feigned retreats, and precise destruction of leadership. Armies collapsed not because every soldier died, but because command died first. In Cairo, sultanates understood the deeper meaning. If Egypt waited behind its walls, the Mongols would choose when to attack. And the Mongols always chose correctly. But confronting them directly seemed suicidal. Every army that marched east against them had vanished. Then an event changed everything. In 1259, the Great Khan monk died far away in Asia. His death triggered a succession crisis across the Mongol Empire. Hulagu, the Mongol commander in the Middle East, withdrew most of his army eastward to participate in the power struggle, leaving behind a smaller but still formidable force under his general Kitbuka. For the first time, the Mongols in the region were not overwhelming. Most rulers still submitted. Kutuz did the opposite. When Mongol envoys arrived in Cairo demanding surrender, as they had demanded from every other ruler, Kutuz ordered them executed. Their heads were displayed on the gates. It was not merely defiance. It was calculation. He understood something few had grasped. Mongol warfare depended on psychological dominance as much as military superiority. If fear governed decisions, the war was already lost. Egypt had to fight before fear could decide for them. But fighting required preparation beyond courage. The Mamluks studied the geography of Syria and Palestine, valleys, hills, water sources, and the narrow corridors armies had to pass through. They did not seek open plains where Mongol cavalry excelled. They searched for constraint, terrain that limited maneuver, terrain that punished speed. For the first time in their westward expansion, the Mongols would not choose the battlefield. The Mamluks would. Meanwhile, Kitbuka advanced southward, confident from years of victory. His forces had defeated armies larger than the one forming in Egypt. To him, the Mamluks were another regional power about to learn submission. He marched toward Palestine, expecting retreat. Instead, the Mamluk army marched north. This alone altered the psychological balance. Mongol campaigns relied on enemies, waiting passively behind walls, allowing reconnaissance and preparation. Now an enemy was actively seeking confrontation, forcing decisions rather than reacting to them. Kutuz and his general Baybars coordinated movements carefully. Scouts screened their advance. Supply lines remained close to water sources, and information from local populations guided positioning. They were not chasing the Mongols. They were shaping where the Mongols would go. In previous campaigns, Mongol commanders manipulated opponents into disadvantageous ground. Here, they unknowingly advanced into territory studied for months. The Jezreel Valley, Ain Jalut, became the focal point. a place of springs and surrounding hills, where wide cavalry formations could be broken into segments and hidden forces could remain unseen until the decisive moment. Kit Bukka did not yet realize the pattern of reversing against him. For decades, Mongol victories followed a predictable structure: provoke, lure, encircle. Now the Mamluks prepared to apply the same logic in reverse, allowing Mongol confidence to carry them into terrain designed to fracture their mobility. By the time both armies approached each other, the battle had already begun in planning. The Mongols believed they were advancing into another submission. The Mamluks knew they were drawing them into a test no Mongol army in the West had yet faced, an enemy that understood their method and refused to play its role. The confrontation at Ain Jalut would not simply be a clash of forces. It would be a contest over who controlled the conditions of war itself. And for the first time since the Mongol expansion began, the steppe horsemen were riding toward a battlefield they did not choose. The decision to confront them in the Levant was therefore not an act of desperation. It was an act of design. The moment the Mongol aura of inevitability began to crack, long before the first arrow flew, the Mongols believed they were pursuing a retreat. For decades, that belief had always ended the same way, with their enemy dead. Across Asia and the Middle East, armies had broken themselves chasing Mongol riders who appeared to flee in fear, only to find the flight was bait and the battlefield already chosen. The pattern was so reliable that it had become instinct. When an opponent withdrew, Mongol commanders pressed harder. Retreat meant weakness. Speed meant victory. In the summer of 1260, that instinct would lead them into a place they did not understand. The Jezreel Valley was not a vast, open steppe. It was a corridor. To the north rose the hills of Galilee. To the south, the ridges of Mount Gilboa. Springs cut to the land, forcing movement along predictable paths. Cavalry could maneuver, but not freely. Visibility changed with every rise in ground. What appeared empty from one direction concealed entire formations from another. The Mamluks studied this ground carefully. Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars understood the Mongols were not merely strong. They were systematic. Their victories depended on observation, speed, and controlled distance. So the Mamluks designed a battlefield where observation failed, speed fractured, and distance could not be maintained. Instead of avoiding the Mongols, Baybars moved forward with an advance force. He did not seek decisive engagement. He sought attention. When Mongol scouts detected the Mamluk vanguard, they found exactly what they expected: a smaller force probing and then withdrawing. Baybar skirmished briefly, loosed arrows, then fell back southward toward Ain Jalut. Kit Bukka saw opportunity. This was familiar ground in his experience. The enemy showing courage but lacking strength, the beginning of collapse. For years, Mongol generals had responded the same way. Pursue immediately. Press retreat. Do not allow the opponent to recover. So he followed. The first stage of the lure began with speed. Baybar's cavalry maintained distance but never disappeared. Each time the Mongols closed, the Mamluks retreated just far enough to remain visible. The goal was not escape. It was direction. Behind the retreating vanguard, the main Mamluk army moved into concealed positions. Qutuz deployed forces among the folds of the terrain, hidden behind rises and tree lines near the springs of Ain Jalut. Units dismounted to reduce visibility. Banners were lowered. Dust was minimized. Entire formations vanished from view only miles from the approaching Mongols. In the open plains of Asia, such concealment would have been impossible. Here, the valley itself acted as a wall. Kit Bukka continued forward, confident that the enemy was revealing its weakness. He had defeated larger armies than this. The Mamluks seemed determined but disorganized, a perfect opponent for a decisive charge. What he did not yet see was absence. The valley looked empty because the army he sought was waiting beyond sight. Baybar slowed his retreat as he approached the chosen ground. Skirmishes intensified slightly, suggesting fatigue. Mongol riders pressed closer, exchanging arrows. The engagement felt increasingly immediate. Just one more push and the enemy would break. The Mongols accelerated. The moment they crossed deeper into the valley, the geometry of battle changed. The hills restricted wide encirclement maneuvers. Lines stretched thinner than intended. Visibility broke into fragments. Communication between wings relied on riders navigating uneven ground rather than clear sight lines. Still, the Mongols advanced, convinced the enemy line lay ahead. Then the vanguard halted. Baybar's cavalry turned and engaged with sudden aggression, charging briefly before falling back again. To Kitbuka, it looked like a desperate last attempt to cover retreat. He committed more forces forward. That decision carried his army into the center of the trap. Kutuz waited. The hidden Mamluk units remained silent, while the Mongol formation extended along the valley floor. Time passed not in minutes, but in positioning. Every step forward by the Mongols tightening their vulnerability. The Mongols, masters of the famed retreat, were now experiencing its reverse. For the first time in their western campaigns, they were reacting rather than dictating. When the signal finally came, it was not subtle. The Mamluk horns sounded across the valley. Banners rose from behind hillsides. Fresh cavalry surged from concealment into the Mongol flanks. What had appeared an exposed enemy suddenly became a surrounding one. Kitbuka recognized the situation immediately. This was no collapsing force. This was prepared battle. He attempted to reorganize his lines for maneuver, but the terrain that had concealed the Mamluks now hindered his own coordination. Units that should have wheeled freely encountered slopes and broken visibility. The Mongols still fought with discipline. They countercharged, seeking to regain initiative, but the timing had shifted. Instead of choosing the moment of engagement, they were responding to it. The lure had succeeded because it exploited expectation. For decades, Mongol commanders had trained themselves to trust retreat as the beginning of victory. Here, retreat was the beginning of constraint. The valley became crowded with movement. Arrows darkened the air from both sides. Charges met countercharges at distances too short for prolonged maneuver. The Mongol army, accustomed to shaping battle through space, now fought inside boundaries set by the opponent. Kutuz committed reserves gradually, never revealing his full strength at once. Each wave appeared as reinforcement rather than plan, reinforcing the illusion that the Mamluks were barely holding together while steadily tightening control. Kitbuka realized the danger but refused withdrawal. Mongol doctrine valued decisive engagement once begun, and retreat through restricted terrain risked collapse. He pressed forward to break the center before the trap could close fully, but the center was not weak. It was waiting. The hidden deployment had transformed the battlefield from open maneuver into controlled confrontation. The Mongols could still fight, and they did, but they no longer fought on terms they understood best. The steppe army that had lured countless enemies into destruction now found itself inside the same principle: movement guided into disadvantage. The lure into the Jezreel Valley was therefore not a single moment but a sequence: retreat, pursuit, concealment, commitment. Each stage removed a layer of Mongol advantage until their speed became crowding and their confidence became exposure. By the time the fighting fully erupted, the decisive factor was already settled. The Mongols had entered the valley believing they chased victory. In reality, they had arrived exactly where their enemy wanted them to stand. The moment the horns echoed across the valley, the Mongols understood something had changed. For decades, they had shaped battles before they fought them. At Ain Jalut, for the first time in the West, the ground itself refused to obey them. Kitbuka's riders had entered the Jezreel Valley expecting maneuver, wide arcs, layered charges, and the familiar rhythm of steppe warfare. Instead, the terrain narrowed their world. Hills blocked sightlines. Springs and uneven ground broke formations. Dust did not drift freely. It hung low and confused signals. And now enemies appear where moments earlier there had been nothing. Mamluk cavalry surged from concealed slopes and struck the Mongol flanks. Their timing was precise, not reckless. They did not rush blindly into the famous Mongol counterattack. They struck, withdrew behind cover, and struck again, forcing the Mongols to fight in fragments instead of fluid movement. Kitbuka reacted instantly, rallying his men into disciplined formations. The Mongols countercharged with their usual aggression, loosing arrows and driving forward to break the center before encirclement tightened. For a moment, the old pattern seemed to return. Their advance pushed into the Mamluk line, and some units fell back under pressure. But the retreat was measured. Kutuz had anticipated this response. He allowed the Mongol center to press deeper into the valley, while the hidden wings continued to close around them. What looked like progress was actually distance gained from escape routes. In open steppe, a Mongol breakthrough created opportunity. Here, it created isolation. As the Mongol vanguard pushed forward, their flanks stretched farther from mutual support. The ridges separated riders who could not see each other, and messengers struggled across uneven ground under arrow fire. Coordination, the foundation of Mongol warfare, began to fracture. Still, the Mongols fought fiercely. They were not collapsing. They were adapting. Units wheeled to counter the flanking attacks, arrows cutting down advancing Mamluks, and charges regained ground temporarily. But every maneuver required time, and every moment spent reforming allowed new Mamluk reserves to appear from concealment. The battle turned into a contest over space. The Mamluks did not need to outride the Mongols. They needed only to deny them room. Baybars led repeated attacks that drew Mongol cavalry towards slopes and watercourses, areas where speed faltered. When the Mongols pursued, fresh units struck from angles they could not anticipate. Instead of a single decisive engagement, the fighting became layered. Pressure applied from multiple directions, forcing constant reaction. Then the psychological balance shifted. Sultan Kutuz removed his helmet, raised his voice across the lines, and ordered a full assault. His personal commitment signaled that the moment of endurance had passed into the moment of decision. The Mamluk army surged forward with renewed intensity. For the Mongols, this was unfamiliar. Their enemies usually broke under sustained pressure. Here, resistance strengthened as battle continued. Kit Bukka attempted to regroup for a decisive countercharge. He concentrated his remaining strength to break through the Mamluk center and reopen maneuver space. The attack struck hard, cutting into the line and threatening collapse. For minutes, the outcome hung uncertain, but the terrain betrayed the momentum. The valley floor constricted movement just as the charge reached full speed. The riders could not spread to exploit success. Instead, they compressed together, losing the lateral freedom required for Mongol tactics. Mamluk cavalry closed from both sides, transforming a breakthrough into a surrounded spear point. Arrows struck from elevated positions. Lances followed. The Mongol advance stalled. Kit Bukka continued fighting at the front, refusing retreat. Mongol doctrine valued decisive engagement, and he committed himself to one final effort to reverse the tide. Yet the advantage of initiative had already shifted. Every attempt to reorganize met fresh attack. Before completion, gradually, the Mongol lines bent inward. The army that once created encirclements now felt the pressure of one. Not a perfect ring, but a tightening field where every withdrawal exposed another flank. Horses tired on uneven ground. Signals were misread. Units fought bravely, but separately. The collapse did not come as panic. It came as inevitability. When Kit Bukka was finally killed in combat, the psychological center of resistance vanished. The Mongol army still resisted fiercely, but cohesion dissolved into isolated fighting groups, seeking escape northward through terrain already controlled by the Mamluks. Some riders broke through and fled. Many did not. By late afternoon, the battlefield belonged to the Mamluks. The significance of Ain Jalut reached beyond the dead left on the valley floor. For the first time in their westward expansion, a Mongol army had been decisively stopped in open battle by a prepared opponent. The effect spread quickly. Cities that had once surrendered at the mere rumor of Mongol arrival now reconsidered. The aura of invincibility cracked. The Mongols were still formidable, but no longer unstoppable. Their momentum, built on psychological dominance as much as military success, faltered. Strategically, the defeat halted the Mongol advance toward Egypt and North Africa, without secure victory in the Levant. Further expansion west became uncertain. The frontier stabilized, and future campaigns faced resistance instead of collapse. But the deeper consequence was intellectual. Ain Jalut demonstrated that Mongol warfare depended on conditions. Speed required space. Deception required expectation. Coordination required visibility. Remove those elements, and even the greatest cavalry army in the world could be forced into equal combat. The Mamluks had not won through greater numbers or superior weapons. They had won by choosing where the Mongols would fight. In later years, Mongol forces returned to the region and fought again, sometimes winning battles, sometimes losing them. Yet the pattern of inevitable conquest never returned in the same form. Opponents studied terrain more carefully. Commanders sought to deny maneuver rather than match it. The valley at Ain Jalut became more than a battlefield. It became proof that the expansion of empires is not only measured by strength, but by adaptation. For decades, the Mongols had turned geography into a weapon against others. Here, geography became a weapon against them. The collapse of Mongol momentum did not end their power, but ended their certainty. The world they entered afterward was different, one that no longer surrendered simply because riders appeared on the horizon, and in that difference lay the legacy of the battle. The Mongols had conquered continents by controlling how wars were fought. At Ain Jalut, for the first time, someone else controlled it.